Rome. In the 1st century BC, it was not yet an empire ruled by one man. It was a republic, a sprawling, chaotic, and brutal superpower governed by a single institution, the Senate. It was a city of unimaginable wealth and political violence, where ambition was a blood sport. Into this world was born Gaius Julius Caesar. He was not an outsider, but his family, the Julii, had long faded from the center of power. From a young age, Caesar was dangerously ambitious. He claimed descent from the goddess Venus, a sign of his immense self-belief. He lived through the bloody purges of the warlords Marius and Sulla, where he learned a crucial lesson. In Rome, power was not given. It was taken, often at the end of a sword. He possessed a unique combination of charm, intellect, and utter ruthlessness. He was a brilliant orator who could sway the Roman mob, a cunning politician who amassed enormous debts to fund his rise, and a man who understood that the ultimate key to power in Rome lay not in the Senate house, but on the battlefield. He needed an army, he needed a war, and he found one in the vast, untamed lands to the north, Gaul. In 58 BC, Caesar was appointed governor of a Roman province bordering Gaul, a territory inhabited by hundreds of fierce, independent Celtic tribes. He was given 4 legions. Over the next 8 years, he would use this position to wage one of the most brilliant and brutal campaigns of conquest in history. He had no official mandate to conquer all of Gaul, but he didn't care. He provoked wars, broke treaties, and pushed his legions to their absolute limits. He drove back Germanic invaders, crossed the Rhine River, and even launched a daring, albeit temporary, invasion of the mysterious island of Britain. His masterpiece was the Siege of Alesia. Facing a massive Gallic army under the charismatic chieftain Vercingetorix, Caesar was surrounded and outnumbered 4-1. In an act of pure military genius, he constructed 2 massive lines of fortifications, one to keep the Gauls trapped inside the fortress, and another to keep the Gallic relief army out. He fought a battle on 2 fronts simultaneously and won. By the end of the Gallic Wars, Caesar had conquered a territory larger than modern-day France, killed or enslaved over 1 million people, and forged an army of hardened veterans who were fanatically loyal not to the Senate, but to him personally. And in Rome, the Senate was terrified. Caesar had become too rich, too famous, and too powerful. He was no longer a servant of the Republic. He was its rival. The Senate, led by Caesar's former ally and now greatest rival, Pompey the Great, saw the threat clearly. They issued an ultimatum. Caesar must disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, where he would undoubtedly face prosecution and political ruin. Caesar was trapped. To obey would mean the end of his career. To disobey would mean civil war. In January of 49 BC, he marched his 13th legion to the banks of a small river that marked the border between his province and Italy, the Rubicon. To cross it with an army was an act of treason, an open declaration of war against his own country. Ancient sources say he hesitated, weighing the monumental consequences of his actions. He knew this was the point of no return. Then he uttered the famous words, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. He gave the order to advance. The crossing of the Rubicon was more than a military maneuver. It was a revolutionary act. It was the moment one man's ambition was pitted directly against the 500-year-old traditions of the Roman Republic. The civil war for the soul of Rome had begun. The Senate and Pompey had more legions, more resources, and control of Rome itself. They represented the full, established might of the Republic. But Caesar had 2 things they lacked: an army of hardened veterans who adored him, and a revolutionary concept of speed they called celeritas. He did not move like a general. He moved like a force of nature. He swept down through Italy so quickly that panic gripped the capital. Senators fled their villas, leaving their fortunes behind. Pompey, a brilliant but more conventional general, was utterly outmaneuvered. He had expected a long, drawn-out preparation for war. Instead, Caesar was at his throat in a matter of weeks. Pompey and the bulk of the Senate were forced to abandon Rome itself, fleeing across the Adriatic Sea to Greece to gather their main forces. It was a humiliating retreat, and it handed Caesar a massive psychological and political victory without a single major battle. With Italy secured, Caesar's next move was a masterstroke of strategy. Instead of chasing Pompey to Greece, he turned west. In a lightning campaign of just 49 days, he marched his army to Spain and crushed Pompey's most experienced legions there, famously remarking, "I went to fight an army without a general and returned to fight a general without an army." He had secured his rear, and now the entire western Mediterranean was his. Only then did he turn to face his great rival. The final showdown came in 48 BC at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece. On paper, Caesar should have lost. He was massively outnumbered in both infantry and cavalry, and his supply lines were cut, his legions on the verge of starvation. Pompey's camp was filled with confident senators already arguing over who would get Caesar's titles after the victory. But Caesar was a master of the human element. Seeing that Pompey's cavalry was his greatest threat, he created a hidden fourth line of his most disciplined infantry, giving them specific instructions not to throw their javelins, but to use them as stabbing spears aimed at the faces of the enemy horsemen. The tactic was brutal and brilliant. When Pompey's cavalry charged, they were met not with a volley of spears, but with a wall of points aimed at their eyes. The cavalry broke and fled in terror, leaving Pompey's infantry flank exposed. Caesar's veterans then smashed into the disorganized enemy line, and the battle turned into a rout. Pompey the Great, once the hero of Rome, fled the field and sailed to Egypt, seeking refuge. But the Egyptian court, fearing Caesar's wrath, betrayed him. As he stepped ashore, he was assassinated. When Caesar arrived, he was presented with Pompey's severed head. But instead of triumph, Caesar reportedly wept. He was a Roman, and this was a Roman tragedy. He had defeated his enemies, but in doing so, had broken the republic he claimed to serve. He was now the undisputed and lonely master of the Roman world. When Caesar returned to Rome, he was not just a returning general. He was its absolute conqueror. He was showered with honors, staging magnificent triumphs that celebrated his victories not over foreigners, but over his fellow Romans, a shocking break with tradition. He showered the common people with gold from his Gallic conquests and hosted lavish games, securing their adoration. He was a capable and energetic ruler, launching ambitious reforms with breathtaking speed. He revised the hopelessly inaccurate Roman calendar, creating the Julian calendar, a system so effective it remains the basis for our own today. He planned grand public works, offered land to his veterans, and passed laws to relieve the crushing burden of debt on the populace. Crucially, he instituted a policy of clementia, or clemency. Instead of slaughtering his political opponents as past Roman warlords had done, he pardoned them. He allowed his former enemies to return to Rome and even resume their positions in the Senate. Men like Cassius and Marcus Brutus, who had fought against him, were forgiven and promoted. It was an act of political genius, meant to heal the wounds of civil war. It would also prove to be his most fatal mistake. But his ambition had no limits. The line between a temporary leader and a permanent monarch began to dissolve. He had his image placed on Roman coins while he was still alive, a practice once reserved for gods and the ancient, hated kings. He accepted the position of Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. A dictator was a temporary emergency office in the Republic. To hold it for life was to be a king in all but name. To the traditionalist Roman aristocracy, this was blasphemy. The very foundation of their republic for 500 years was the violent overthrow and rejection of kings. The word rex, or king, was the ultimate political poison. Yet Caesar now sat in the Senate on a golden throne, wore the purple robes of royalty, and even had a month of the year, Quintilis, renamed July in his honor. The final straw for many came during a public festival when his loyal consul, Mark Antony, tried 3 times to place a crown on his head. 3 times Caesar refused, to the cheers of the crowd. But the act, likely a piece of political theater to test the public mood, was seen by his enemies as an unforgivable display of royal ambition. In the shadows of the Senate House, a conspiracy began to form, not just of rivals, but of the very men he had pardoned. The conspiracy was a dangerous mix of personal jealousy and genuine political principle. Its leaders were Gaius Cassius Longinus, a bitter and pragmatic senator who had never forgiven Caesar, and Marcus Junius Brutus. Brutus was the symbolic heart of the plot. He believed he was descended from the man who had first expelled the kings from Rome 500 years earlier. He was a man obsessed with his ancestral duty, and a man whom Caesar had loved, pardoned, and treated like a son. It was this deep personal connection that made the betrayal so profound. They saw themselves not as murderers, but as liberatores, liberators, acting as patriots to save the Republic from a tyrant. They recruited over 60 other senators, binding them with a secret oath. They knew they had to act quickly, as Caesar was planning to leave on a new military campaign against the Parthian Empire, where he would be untouchable. They chose their moment, the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BC, during a meeting of the Senate to be held at the theater of Pompey. The day itself was thick with omens. A soothsayer had famously warned Caesar to beware the Ides of March. His wife Calpurnia had been plagued by nightmares, dreaming she held his murdered body and begged him not to go. He initially agreed to stay home, but a conspirator sent to his house convinced him that to ignore the Senate would be seen as an act of arrogance. On his way, someone thrust a scroll into his hand detailing the entire plot, but in the press of the crowd, he never had a chance to read it. As he took his seat on his golden throne, the conspirators surrounded him under the pretense of presenting a petition. One of them, Julius Caesar, grabbed his toga and pulled it from his shoulders. This was the signal. They swarmed him, stabbing him with daggers they had hidden in their scrolls. Ancient accounts say he fought back fiercely until he saw Brutus, his protege, his friend, among the assassins, dagger in hand. Heartbroken by this ultimate betrayal, he uttered his last words. While Shakespeare immortalized them as et tu, Brute, the historian Suetonius reports he may have said in Greek, kai su teknon, you too, my child. He then covered his face with his toga and fell at the base of a great statue of his defeated rival, Pompey, bleeding to death from 23 wounds. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Then, panic erupted. The other senators fled in terror. The assassins raised their bloody daggers, with Brutus attempting to make a speech, proclaiming that tyranny was dead. They believed they had saved the Republic. They could not have been more wrong.